hello, and welcome to and welcome to hello, and welcome to Pop Cartoon Kabala, Kabala. Coming at you very suddenly from the Elah Valley. I mean, like super abruptly with an old thing. Old things are the worst. No, old things are the best. What's the difference between a good old thing and a lame, stale, unkept, just like thing? And I'll tell you something you already know, because that's the nature of the thing. The difference is how it's kept, right? If you leave it open, it's very exposed. If you keep it nicely, you might have it later on, more likely, if it's like in a little vessel, right? And let's say the traditional mythos around Hanukkah has to do with a thing kept in the back that actually was kept well enough, And let's say the esoteric mythology around that little thing kept and what made it keep is that it's the original thing from before in the most absolute and complete way. Let's say in the same way that like time is kind of cyclical, in the same way. And yet every holiday feels so special, right? Every holiday is not one of these again. It's like, what a relief. I'm glad to be back. And this is part of the time and space cycle, right? As much as a place has positive associations or, stable temples or practices, anywhere you can keep something going is amazing. As alas, it's just so easy for things to not last very long. Good things, don't necessarily get kept very well. A fruit that falls on the ground, super delicious. What is the form that lets it endure? And it's the seeds, but it's also everything around the seeds, famously. Right? Wet, cool, but somehow bright. Somehow from the wet and cool, there is a jaunty joviality. And I think this is why Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter. But let me tell you about the thing hidden inside that makes it rule. And by rule, I mean like rule, Say what you will about whatever the Hasmonean problem was. Say what you will about Jupiter as demiurge, They rule. Vini vidi. Vidi vidi. Vidi 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 vidi. They overcome. And in this way, it's a very natural progression from the priesthood that the Hasmonean thing was, Hasmonean, Hashmonai, where they had been the ministry and other people did all the administry, There was kings, Davidic kings, Ephraimic kings, regional tribal chiefs. But then the Kohanim themselves stepped out of the role of basically keepers and preservers, right? Because a lot of ministry is putting things away and taking them up, curating. Why do they call it a kura, Because he curates. And to cure is basically to preserve, right? Put salt on it and save it, curandero, the cure is basically put a little salt on it and save you, kuro. Curio is when it brings you in. What a curio, house of curios. Now, car in the Old Semitic has to do with cold, right? And part of the problem of the world is how much the coldness of the predatory leads to a sort of a push. I think a lot of the Hanukkah and solstice narrative has a lot to do with a pushback against a darkness, right? A darkness identified with the state. Choshech al pnei tehom. The original darkness that is the state, as if the chaos isn't also the state, as if the order isn't the problem of the state. I think many of us have lived through different administrations and lives where it really did feel like order was more the problem or neglect was more the problem. But those are very similar things, aren't they? Like a hyper attentive state versus a sort of dismissive state as the state policy are not so different, actually. And this is part of why the judicial, has always been associated, let's say, the space between Jupiter and Apollo. Because the justice itself is Apollo on some level, right? But you heard the ridiculousness of what I say. Justice is clearly Nike, I guess the twin sister, but she's the moon and he's the sun. The judgment, the authority of Jupiter is encouragement, is like, hey, we're going to do this. It's mostly encouragement. This is the joy of the lion. Not to compare horses to lions, But let's say the difference between a centaur and a horse is how much of a dominating, commanding presence they are, especially armed, especially sort of armed, as it were. I want to tell you quick Bnei Yissaschar stuff in the hopes of organizing some of this enthusiasm. Because I think a lot of the whole joy of the thing that is the build up to the winter solstice has to be and is a certain amount of jaunty push, but you can't do a fake one. And a fake one doesn't mean not jaunty, because part of the problem is winter organizing is about the pending disaster. It's cold, it's wet. And winter domination is a lot about the hope of managing around and through the cold and wet. And I think that is one of the main administrative tools of a superstate, of Babylon and Rome. So I want to learn with you guys a quick piece that I think elaborates this. Circa the early 1800s, the Bnei Yissaschar, Tzvi Melech Dinov, is looking up the old Kabbalistic ideas of the old Polish sort of esoteric scholars who are talking about politics the whole time, because the biblical esoterics have a lot to do with politics as metaphor and metaphor as politics, by which I mean the process by which a state goes from a relief, a rivacha, to a problem. If there's one thing we're really historically invested in is understanding the patterns of power itself so you can handle them. And I think this is why agricultural traditions are also so bound up in things like almanacs and astrologies, because you really do feel responsible for where you are and how to do it. And that is a lot of the legacy of the Polish mystics from the beginning of when Poland got really into esoterica until they just sort of neglected it, and the books were still there back when libraries were a thing you could just go to and could be refined around the new economy that formed in the wake of the 1800s when Poland became a very different sort of international creature amidst, everything else. Or Torah, this is Bnei Yissaschar, Maimar Bes, the second one. Oy da ben yan galis khan mizim psuke Torah מעניינים על פי כמה הקדמות ואשר נעשה רמז לתורה אשר רצוי ואני מבטח שמפרח הפרצת תלמידים הייתה זו תורה ונקרא תורה. So let's say there's innovation and the thing that makes life feel worth living in, whatever is fresh in the oil, whatever stays well in the oil. And it's always kind of a surprise and also always kind of a comfort. He's going to introduce a theology here of the pattern that makes the hard kind of nice. And I hope I don't ruin it, but he's pretty straightforward. The whole thing is not written down. Hanukkah. It's made up, man, but it's not, right? It's observed, and it emerges like a lot of the weirdly permanent institutions of all of our lives, sort of late, but is associated with something earlier. So the rest of this piece, he tries to connect it to the earlier things in order to understand what Sagittarius Keshet is about at its best and its most complete in the context of the thing afterwards, which is going to be Capricorn. And this is why the holiday is in between the two. And he's going to quote one guy for all of this. One guy who I think is really the best theologian of astrology from the medieval period, Eliezer of Worms. Ktav Harav Ir Kadesh. He calls him our angel. They translate it in the books of Enoch, right? Irin Kadishin as like Grigori, right? As watchers. Now, it's not a very good translation of the word for that whole phylum of angels. It literally means awake. So it's a sense of being awake and therefore I'm watching, like a watcher. But like that's a terrible translation. Maybe Grigori is more a word for Gregorius, Irin, Ir Kadvish. And he calls him this over and over again. Asher dibrenu divrei Kabala v'Kabala Melial Zechor Tov. Rabbe Eliezer of Worms received it from Elijah the prophet. He doesn't say this for everybody. He doesn't give everyone a big intro. He keeps reintroducing him every time he quotes him. And I'm just going to skip to the parts where he quotes him because they're the most salient. And they are what this pattern is about, which is the 36 lights in the context of the 4 empires. Like there's a rule to be noticed from how breakdowns happen. Hello, Baal Harokeach. Eliezer of Worms, they call him the master of mixers. Harokeach is the thing that you make drugs through, mixing. Harokeach. That's what they called him, Harokeach HaGadol. And here it is. Parshas Emor al Kohanim Mitchil Shabbat Regalim Pesach Atzeret Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippurim Sukkot Dvar Moshe Moed Adonai Bnei Yisrael Smichei Lekhu Elav Shemen Zayit Zach Kasismor Remez LeChanukah Shemen Zayit Mitzvah Min HaMechorah. First, they want to know where it is, and at the end of where they mention the holiday of Sukkot in the Bible, they just start talking about the work of lighting candles and setting them up. שאלו הגימל חדשים תשרי חשמל להם כסוגלים מחלק עד הבית כי הם המקדשים נעשים לבניה שערכה אפרים מנשה בנימין יזכב בנימין מש מקובלנו הגימל סיף כל המקום מסתרב מקובל עם אדם שמיכה מלכרה בתור אפרים מנשה קרובינו שמעי בני ראובן. Sorry, this is live. He goes on a long thing about the relationship between Scorpio and Libra in the form of Ephraim and Menashe amidst Binyamin and introduces it. But part of the problem is how much the development growth mechanism is an individuation away from mechanism. Like Ephraim, Menashe, and Binyamin, the Rachel kids, are a separate leg of a separate thing because it is a rejection of the intuitive into the principled, right? That's the problem and challenge and opportunity and depth of Libra and Scorpio. And from that is a thing that's already strong, here associated with Binyamin. Hine Kislev Binyamin b'nei Nogim Nasiv Kol M'kometz Derek Mukabal Pinam Smaktam Makras B'Torah Ephraim Menashe Reuven Mishmoni Eli b'nei Reuven Shimon Gematria Ephraim Menashe. Aha. So he is arcing this relative to the firstborn pattern at the beginning of the cycle, really here in the summertime, Cancer and Leo. It's the same gematria, same amount of letters as Reuven, as Ephraim Menashe, with the extra. And none of this is the thing I was excited about. And he wants to throw in another thing. And it's not the thing I'm excited to say. And it's not the thing I'm excited to look at. Command the children of Israel is number-wise one more than in the days of Mattityahu ben Yochanan. But he's building a pattern, and he's binding to a pattern, having to do with the light that is hidden. Nehorot ki haor hahu asher nitkam Mattityahu ben Yochanan hu hara min haor shenivra b'yom harishon. As if to say, the light that was set in those days in that thing, into a pattern that recurred and made it into canon. And canon is popular practice. Just Hanukkah is a thing. It totally is a thing. Humanity is a thing. Winter Solstice is a thing. Hanukkah is just a thing. Because the light that was set is an awakening of the light from the first moment of creation, from the first day of creation, from the first 3 days of creation. You guys know the story. There was light. But then the light vanished when the sun became the loudest light in the room. Because, you guys know the Hanukkah story. That light was miraculous. They had light. They had oil. It was a miracle. 1 days lasted for so long because it was just a deeper, truer oil. Now, I don't know how literal this has to be, but let's say light that is hidden finds its way back. And light is hidden in order to make it be there when you need it or when you get to it. And oil is for light. And priesthood, if there's one thing those guys are good for, it's turning on lights. Ministry, taking care of something, setting something up, making something clear. A lot of it is a lot about turning on lights, keeping things going, starting things and making it clear how to relate to them through light. And a miracle around light reflects an older, truer light. Because let's get weird, right? If reality is fictive, then it wouldn't hurt so much. But reality is not fictive by definition, right? Reality is as cold and as hot as we ever feel and as we ever communicate, And so the thing from before the real is the thing that breaks through whenever we're just very relieved in a way that feels somehow righter than anything before and after. And that's really where we want to build from, That is the greatest loves of our lives. Those are the great cultures of our lives, the things we want to build from in the wake of how good they were. That's kulto, right? And so it is all the time. Let's say the institution of solstice into year. Now, this is an insane thing to think about in the context of our experience of being alive. Why do we only have one winter solstice and one summer solstice? Because the sun, because the moon. What if there's just a deeper pattern that lets patterns be noticed at all, and they are made of a balance between wet and dry, hot and cold? And this is the general rule of worlds that occurred in the context of our world as we have it, amidst everything else. But also is a bit inherent in the nature of creation and creations, hence a tendency, tendency within a cycle that is relatively consistent between Sagittarius and Capricorn. Right there, the winter solstice, where just like everything that lives has to live within a cycle, and everything that lives within a cycle, part of that cycle is the full dip into too much one way, and then to come back around, the ability to not be able to avoid the return on the thing. And I think this is part of the theology of, the Trinity in general, all the Trinities, but the hidden light, which is expressed at the end, has never quite been seen, or has it? But then every so often, a little more of it comes, like the oil in the back of the room. הנה האורגנוס נגרס בתורה, כמו שכתבתי כמה פעמים במקמננו, But here's the thing, where is the light hidden? It's hidden in the gospel, man. Now, let's apply this as a bit of a general principle. Where is divinity? Wherever you look for it, right? Like, the Oreganus, where is it ganus? The hidden light is hidden in the Torah. Now, that sounds obnoxious or obvious. And those things go together, obnoxious and obvious, whatever. But what does it mean that's hidden in the Torah, right? It means if you just look at it the way everyone's looking at it, you won't see it. But you can use it to show everybody everything. And I think this is a general truisms about abolitionisms and conservatisms. You need religion for either one, because you're pointing to an axis of like, hey, we have to. And you know what the problem with the world today? There's no accountability. There's no mechanism for a sort of charismatic accountability, except for sort of success failure, which then becomes all the other ones, all the other standards that do become just popular standards. And from those popular standards is the return of ministry, because it just expresses itself through the repressed, neglected. I'll give you an example. Houthis. How'd the Houthis take over Yemen? What happened, man? And it's really, really, really very simple. A different thing took over called modernity. Modernity did its best, had more space in Yemen to express itself. Sana'a was the biggest city, except for New York, in the early 20th century. Just the most popular, most crowded, just happening. And now, part of the problem, it's an interesting parallel to Iran, because I think Iran did not let the communists take over the revolution, but Yemen did. Yemen had like two different communist countries, like each one more like this than that one in the classic sort of campus kind of way, and just burned itself out, failed for whatever reason. The innovation, the attempt to build from idealism overcame, and a more traditional, reliable, stable force took over. Just traditional People's Mountain thing. That's what the Houthis are. That's all. I was reading an article today, The new propaganda is that the U.S. is fighting the war in Venezuela in order to fight the war on the Islamic jihadis. These are one war. Did you know that? Apparently, none of the other drug-producing countries, they're producing drugs, but like none of them are as important to overcome as Venezuela, specifically because they're running it effectively. So it's very good to just bomb their boats and have no accountability about just attacking people, and none of it. In the same kind of way that a successful understructure made of traditionalism fills the gap where an idealistic disasters happen. And I think that is part of the Hellenism narrative. Too much light, too much heat until it becomes experienced as darkness. And this is the general challenge and failure of maintaining a good system and a good kingdom, right? Let's say Poland was quite a wonderful crisis for a long time. And I'm sure, alhamdulillah, still is. But let's say when emancipations first took hold, once access to the wider range of human education was invited, and a cosmopolitan that could educate people and be a refuge just took off. And this is the grace of Jupiter that is the organizing principle, I think, in the old religion. Just get together, everybody. This is Marduk. Come on. Let's get together, everybody, and be a wave and be a new solution. And this is the problem both with Hellenism on the one hand, but really the Hasmonean revolution against everything else in the name of traditionalism. First, a sort of oppressive condescension. The early Hellenists weren't really the Greeks, they were just into it. They were just into sort of syncretism and into reading things as metaphors. But then they also had just a predatory condescension where it just got mean and obnoxious. And eventually the priest would rose up and whoa. And it successfully won the hearts and minds. And isn't that part of the thing that's hard to talk about, what happens in a lot of sort of political situations where a ostensibly vilificable movement will form out of the underlying stable assumptions that haunt the back of a civilization. And this is what nationalism is on some level, right? Just the popular assumptions that you don't have to try to install because they're already quietly the ruling dogma. And then it's just a question of circulation. Like the Houthi model really worked a lot more reliably, Hate to say nice things about Hamas, or Muslim Brotherhood. Historically, right, we used to really just appreciate the hope that they were better at managing themselves and each other. But then success forces every stable political and social structure to be confronted with the problem of its own success. And this is why Jupiter devolves into Mars traditionally, or evolves into Saturn. Just as bad in a lot of ways, depending on what you're, into. And part of why the problem of the first half of the winter solstice is the come down into how intense and how hard things are. And this is part of, I think, the whole concept of anti-Semitism, the whole concept, let's say, even the bad use of the idea of anti-Semitism, which is to say co-option of it to mean kind of anything politically convenient, whatever I don't want to talk about is anti-Semitic, and whatever you want to talk about is also anti-Semitic, that's no way to live. It's not jaunty. It's not jovial. Part of what's great about transgressive cultures and speeches, you can just use the words you're not supposed to use. And isn't it funny what a great bonding thing that is? I was sitting in the garden thinking about back when marijuana was very illegal, it was really fun to try and be involved in it. And then once it becomes legal, it's still fun. And it's even more fun and a relief in a lot of ways, the whole relief of just it not being a danger. What a relief. And yet the sense of purpose is a different sense of purpose. And this is part of the transition in, I think, the solstice itself, the winter solstice, where the cold and wet that gives way to a sort of self-righteousness as organizing principle. Because there is nothing to organize around that is warming in the cold and wet except self-righteousness, insecurity and incapacity and a sort of unwillingness and ability to be present is uncompelling. But a militant movement of warmth is very compelling everywhere. It's very compelling. And this is part of the global triumph of all the revolutionary movements around the world. The worst and the best, and of course, the best until they become the worst. This is the crisis of success. The main failure of the Hasmonean Hanukkah victory is, of course, the more successful they got, the more the whole thing was just like, kind of dumb, kind of annoying. Until. I want to talk about this in the context of the 36 lights, in the context of the 4 directions and the 4 empires. And here we go. It's hidden in the things. And so the light and the thing to do, the candle, is hinted to and compared to and understood as itself a metaphor for, oil. What are you carrying, man? You got some good stuff? The good gospel, right? The good word, the good Torah. The Torah, the gospel, the good shit, it flows from wisdom. That's like a quote from the Zohar in Aramaic. Mechachma nafkat. See, the problem with the Enlightenment threatened to ruin everything conceptually because meaning is overcome. So just join the winning team cynically with the rest of us. And so the reaction to it, the reaction to the sort of predatory imperialism of thought itself, of syncretic perfect systems themselves, also has to express itself as wisdom, also wants to express itself as wisdom, cannot help but express itself as wisdom. And so the whole miracle story is about oil. Everyone knows oil is a euphemism for wisdom, right? Athena and her owl and oil, carrying around. He's not quoting Athena. The Gemara, anywhere that the olive oil is found is where you find wisdom. Because people are keeping a thing well. They're keeping a good thing. And olive oil especially. ולמדו מן המקרא, וישלח יואב תקוע, ויקח משם אישה חכמה, משם דקה כי תקוע עלפה לשמן. So, the Talmud describes guy Yoav, general in David's army, sending to the place in between and taking a lady from there, a wise lady, for oil. In order to oil. And so Hanukkah is also oil, candles, alluding to wisdom. And you have this in the very concept of enlightenment, right? If you you have an idea, it lights up. This metaphor is very hard to separate from our literal experience of how real an enlightenment is, how much just suddenly seeing something is like, wow. And taste is like this. Part of what's amazing about olive oil is you can also taste it, and it tastes like light. And it really functions kind of like a congealed, concentrated light. And furthermore, in alchemy, whoever wants to get smarter, go south. And the menorah in the temple is to the south. Whoever wants to get wise, go to the south. And that's where the menorah is, right? For wealth, go north. That's where the breads are. And this wind is consistent. That same wind is always light in the summer, and in the winter is always made of light. And most winds are not like that. And the letter Aleph, the first letter is the first thing, is also associated with wisdom. Kimada ve'alefecha chachma, like to know, and your thousands, but your thousands is your olives. Your olives are wisdom. Aha! Aleph them. I'll F them. I'll F them. The Alkin, Tavin Lifi Zebi Me Matizyahu ben Yochanan im Aleph. Hainu im Harat ha'Aleph Shana Sebyama, Hu Gematria Tzabnei Yisrael. So according to this, just understand this weird gematria in the days of Matizyahu, the son of Yochanan. If you just add the letter Aleph to that, it's the gematria command of the children of Israel, like the first time around, the beginning of everything, which is a euphemism for creation itself, the pressing of the Aleph. And take for yourself a bright, pure, unrefined oil for your illumination, which is to say, can't trust all the oils. A lot of oils get ruined a lot of different ways. A lot of awarenesses are just negatively associated. But wisdom is about keeping something good by seeing what's good inside of it the first time around and coming back to the thing that's still there. And that's what makes wisdom stable. I'm going to say more about the empires soon.